our flesh, I think this, in our flesh, it's hard for us to see God's sovereignty in the moment. Okay? Like in my flesh, it's hard for me to see that God is actually working all sides of the fence of human history, and he's bringing about the redemption of all things. Like in my flesh, sometimes I forget that. In my flesh, sometimes it can seem like God is sitting passively by, watching the injustices and the evil of the world. Like how often, like, do you see something, you watch on TV, you read something, you hear something, you think, why didn't God stop that? Like, why? Is God just like a grumpy old man sitting up on a cloud and just, not doing anything? Like in my flesh, sometimes I believe that lie, that God's passively sitting by when it comes to injustices and evil in the world. Sometimes, like in my flesh, maybe you're like, I feel defeated and hopeless and weary and alone and abandoned. Like sometimes in my flesh, like, and I'm guessing it's you too, like I feel like death and all its relatives are winning. Anybody else? Like, are you with me there? At times, like sometimes, like my heart will get hijacked in those places. And so maybe just a question this morning, like where do you feel hopeless today? Where do you feel weary? Or maybe you're in a sweet spot right now, okay? When you think of that question of hopelessness and weary, what situation or person comes to mind? And I just think today, like Nahum has something for us. Like, so if you have a place of hopelessness in your life today, like if you feel weary, if you feel like a relative of death has a little bit of a voice in your life, or you know someone that you love, that you care about, who's weary or hopeless, I think Nahum's got a good word for us this morning. Something that we can hang on, to be reminded of what's actually true. Because in our flesh, it's easy to believe a lie and to think that's the actual truth. All right, so we're going to watch a little video this morning, and then we're gonna jump in.
The book of the prophet Nahum. This short prophetic book is a collection of poems announcing the downfall of one of Israel's worst oppressors, the ancient empire of Assyria, and its capital city, Nineveh. The Assyrians arose as one of the world's first great empires, and their expansion into Israel resulted in the total destruction and exile of the northern kingdom and its tribes. The Assyrian armies were violent and destructive on a scale that the world had never seen before, and so Israel and its neighbors were awaiting the downfall of Assyria, which eventually came in the year 612 BC. The Babylonians rose up and began a rebellion that overtook Nineveh and brought down the Assyrian Empire. And so, chapter 2 depicts the fall of Nineveh in vivid poetry, and chapter 3 then explores the downfall of the empire as a whole. But this book isn't just an angry tirade against Israel's enemies. The introductory chapter shows us that there is way, way more going on here. The book opens with an incomplete alphabet poem that begins by describing a powerful appearance of God's glory. It's very similar to how the previous book, Micah, began and how the next book, Habakkuk, is going to conclude. And it's God, the all-powerful creator, coming to confront the nations and bring his justice on their evil. And the poem opens by quoting from the famous line of God's self-description after the golden calf incident in the book of Exodus chapter 34. The Lord is slow to anger. He's great in power. He won't leave evil unpunished. And so the rest of the poem goes back and forth, contrasting the fate of the arrogant, violent nations with the fate of God's faithful remnant. When God brings down all the arrogant empires, he will provide refuge for those who humble themselves before him. Now, here's what's really interesting, is that you thought this book was only about Assyria, but Nahum actually nowhere mentions Nineveh or Assyria in chapter 1. And when he describes the downfall of the bad guys, he uses Isaiah's language about the fall of Babylon, which happened much later in history. And not only that, Nahum also describes the downfall of the bad guys as good news for the remnant of God's people. It's a direct allusion to Isaiah's good news about the downfall of Babylon. And so all these little details from chapter 1, they come together to make a key point. For Nahum, the fall of Nineveh is being presented as an example, as an image of how God is at work in history in every age, how he won't allow the arrogant or violent empires of our world to endure forever. And so the message of Nahum is actually very similar to that of Daniel. Assyria stands in a long line of violent empires throughout history, and Nineveh's fate is a memorial to God's commitment to bring down the violent and the arrogant in every age. With this perspective from the opening chapter, the book then returns to its focus on Assyria. And so chapter 2 describes the Battle of Nineveh and the overthrow of the city in progressive stages. So first we see the front line of Babylonian soldiers, and then we read about the charge of the chariots, and then the chaos on the city walls as the city is breached, then the slaughter of Nineveh's people, then the plundering of the city. Chapter 3 goes on to describe the results of the city's downfall for the empire as a whole. So Nahum begins by announcing a woe upon the city whose kings built it with the blood of the innocent. It's an image of how injustice was built into the very system that made Assyria so successful. But their violence has sown the seeds of their own destruction, and so Assyria will fall before Babylon. The book concludes with a taunt against the fallen king of Assyria. He's stricken with a fatal wound, and from among all the nations that he once oppressed, no one comes to help him. Rather, they sing and celebrate his destruction. And that's how the book ends. Now, this is a gloomy book, but it's important to see how Nahum's message addresses the tragic and perpetual cycles of human violence and oppression in every age. Human history is filled with tribes and nations elevating themselves and using violence to take what they want, resulting in the death of the innocent. And the book of Nahum uses Assyria and Babylon as examples to tell us that God is grieved and that he cares about the death of the innocent, and that his goodness and his justice compel him to orchestrate the downfall of oppressive nations. And God's judgment on evil is good news, unless, of course, you happen to be Assyria. Which brings us all the way back to the conclusion of that opening poem in chapter 1, which tells us that the Lord is good and a refuge in the day of distress. He cares for those who take refuge in him. And so the little book of Nahum invites every reader to humble themselves before God's justice and to trust that in his time he will bring down the oppressors of every time and place. And that's what the book of Nahum is all about.
So this is written, it's written to teach and to show Israel that God is not going to ignore injustice. Okay? And that the rise and fall of nations is not just like the ebb and flow, but God's actually moving in the world. Okay? God's actually moving. He cares about what's happening within the world. And so just a few things that I want to point out to you. I want to read verses 1 through 5 here today in the book of Nahum. If you want to pull out your phone, if you have your Bibles with you, it's right after Micah. Okay, and Micah's right after Jonah, so kind of towards the back of the Old Testament that's there. And so we're going to start, I'll go ahead and start at verse 2. It says, "The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. And the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither. The bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him. The hills melt. The earth heaves before him, the world and all who dwell in." I'm going to read just a couple more. Who can stand before his indignation? Who can endure the heat of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken into pieces by him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. Like God is not just going to let evil win. And sometimes it's so easy to feel like, God, are you doing anything? Are you at work anywhere? Do you see the injustice that's happening? Are you going to step in? And Nahum says, absolutely yes. And it's going to be bad news for the folks who don't take refuge underneath him. God is absolutely going to step in. So what's this mean for us within our lives? A couple things that I think are going to be so helpful. The first one is this morning. God is aware of your pain. He knows it. God's aware of your weariness. Or the person that you may be thinking about when we pose the question, like God's aware of their pain. God's aware of their weariness. God's aware of the hopelessness that you or your loved one may be feeling right now in this moment. All right? God's aware of it. Second thing is God is not blind or passive to that. He's not blind or passive to the injustices and the evil of the world. God's not blind and passive to the one that you love who's battling cancer right now. God's not blind and passive to the despair you feel of the person that doesn't have a job they're looking for. God's not blind and passive to the heaviness and the weight that you feel you're carrying in your life in this moment. He's not blind and passive to it. And then just thirdly, God will have the last say. He will have the last say. He will wipe every tear away. We know that even in death, that we have life, that God will have the last say in the redemption of all things. Now, that whole idea that he's aware of our pain, he's not blind or passive, that he will have the last say, it's not just like an idea that we hope for. It's not just like, we've got to play our cards and, I hope I make the right decision and then maybe that'll happen. It's not just a guess, okay? It's not just a guess. Because we know that as Nahum is speaking to God saying, I will not let evil have the last say, we know because of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ that is the case. That in Jesus, God defeated death in Jesus' resurrection and now invites us into that life, but yet we find ourselves living in these in-between times. We find ourselves still living in a world where death is still, and all its relatives is a reality, but we also live with the hope of what is to come. So we just think about Jesus' death this morning. On Friday, Jesus' death on Friday is a glimpse of the fall from the garden. And then we get to Saturday and we're wondering if God's going to put it all back together. We're wondering that as we fall, as it looks like death is winning, will God put it back together? And then Jesus' resurrection on Sunday is the anthem. It is the loud trumpet that says, yes, I will put it all back together. It's the loud trumpet of yes on God's promises within our lives. Now, why is this important for us? Why is this important for us? Well, I think this. I think so many of us live in Saturday, metaphorically, thinking that Friday had the last say. Many of the folks around us, we live in Saturday thinking that Friday's death is the deepest reality of our lives. Sometimes we live as if God is stuck on Friday's cross. And that's the deeper truth within our lives. And so the world says that Friday is the final word, but what the world needs is people who are pointing to Sunday. Like when everybody's life in the midst of despair and hopelessness and weariness is actually the loudest voice in their life, when it looks like Friday's winning, what the world needs is people who are pointing to a different truth, to a deeper truth, to a greater reality, that are pointing to the truth of the resurrection of Sunday morning. The world needs people who are championing Sunday morning. And as Jesus people, we live in the midst of Saturday, not looking to the hopelessness of Friday, but pointing to the hope of Sunday morning. So I think what Nahum is getting at for us today is, how can we be people that are always pointing to a God that says, I will not be silent when it comes to despair and hopelessness and weariness of whatever may be going on in our lives. I will not turn a blind eye to it. And in fact, in the end, I will defeat it. And to show you that I will have the last say, I've actually come into the world in Jesus Christ, who took on the full human suffering, pain, sin, all of it, and defeated it on the cross, and then rose from the dead so that now you could get a glimpse of what it is to come. I think we've got to be people that live in the midst of Saturday, but with our hearts and minds and eyes focused on pointing to Sunday morning. Because the world's got enough folks pointing to Friday. And we're the people. Like, Jesus people are the people where it's our job, mission, to point to Sunday morning and to live that way. It's why we want to be everyday missionaries where we live, work, and play. And so what's that look like? It can be so simple, so simple. I got home yesterday, there was a little message on our little Gospel Family Facebook page, and someone said, hey guys, there's a new family, and their mother, like the wife's mother just passed away. Can we do something for them? Like if you just think, we just bring stuff to worship tomorrow, we're going to make a basket and take it to them. Well, like why would you? We just say like in the basket, like I know like you're experiencing pain and hurt that no one should experience. Like in my mind, I think, one day I'm going to bury my mother, and that's not a good day in my life. Like, it's not a good day. I was telling someone this week, we were talking about moms, and we were actually talking about football. And I was like, when I played football, like when I was like a seventh grader, it was 7th, 8th, 9th grade, they made us all, the seventh graders had to put, little masking tapes on the back of your helmet, and it had your name on it. So they didn't know your name. And so one day it rained a whole bunch that night. And we got to the field, and it was time for practice, but all the coaches were inside. I was like, that's kind of weird, they're inside. And all the 9th graders took all of us 7th graders and just drug us all through the mud and like kicked us, got us all nasty and dirty. And I got home that night, and I was 13, I just sat on my mom's lap and cried. I was like, Mom, they didn't even know my name. They drugged me to the mud, they didn't even know my name. I mean, like it's going to be a bad day when I have to say goodbye to my mom and lay her to the rest. And I'm tempted in that moment to think like Friday wins. But I need people in my life, right? Like this person, I need people in their life that can show up with a little basket that says, let me just point you to Sunday. Let me just point you to a little bit of a deeper truth that's there. So it's not our job to bring Sunday. Are you tracking? Like God does that. God does that work. Like it's our job to point to it. To point to it. To give the possibility that there's a deeper truth than hopelessness and weariness and despair and hurt and pain in our lives. And so this morning, whatever may be going on in your life today, wherever you've got weariness, I just want to speak over you that does not have the last say in your life, even if it feels like it right now. Like you can still feel hopeless today, okay? Like I'm not saying like let's pretend it's not there. And I know some of your stories, and I know things going on with your life, and I know that there's weightiness in this room. There's weightiness that you guys are carrying. There's weightiness within my life, and so those are all true things, and you feel all those things. And just the idea of this hope doesn't mean those things go away. I'm just saying they won't have the last say. I'm just saying that's not going to define your reality, because we know of the truth of Sunday. So I want to encourage you in the midst of weariness or hopelessness, I want to encourage you to embrace the hope and the truth that God will not let evil win. He will not let injustice prevail. He will step in. He will have the last say. And you can hang on that. And then secondly is also embracing that you're an instrument of hope in the world. It's so easy to hit the ground running tomorrow, and we just keep our head down for the next 6 days. Isn't it? Like, it's so easy. There are some weeks, like the week turns around, and Lord's like, wow, love the way you opened your Bible this week, bro. Didn't even crack it. What's your deal? I mean, I know the grind of it's so easy to have our head here. I just think as Jesus people, you guys, we gotta have our eyes up, and we've got to be asking. God, show me how I can point to Sunday. Show me who I need to help see a little glimpse of this hope. And the more we do it, the more we allow the gospel to take territory in people's lives. And I don't know about you, but anytime Jesus takes territory in my life, it hasn't been a bad thing. It hasn't been a bad thing. So one, let's hold on to hope today if you need it, okay? But two, let's be an instrument of that. Does that make sense? This last song that we're going to sing here in just a few moments, it talks about, it's a little spin off the Lord's Prayer of our Father, His will being done on earth as in heaven. And so just know that's He's working for those things in your life, but also let's be instruments of that. Let's be instruments that point to Sunday, to heaven, right? Of God's will being done here as it is there.